traders, how are you? With Marcello. Today we're doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week so you can take advantage of that crisis that's coming. This week we have another bank that failed, First Republic Bank, which is now the second largest bank failure in the history of the United States. And we also have good economic numbers from some companies. And also the something interesting that I thought is they found 19,000 volcanoes on the floor of the ocean. Let's go ahead and get started. So overall this week, we had the situation where First Republic Bank failed. To give you a panorama of the situation, before Silicon Valley Bank failed, they had $206 billion in assets. First Republic Bank, which is the next bank out of San Francisco to fail, actually had $233 billion in assets. So it looks like Warren Buffett was right. He predicted that we were going to have more bank failures. They have arrived. Even Jim Cramer, if you guys know who he is, says that, you know, First Republic was a great bank and then it failed, just like he talked about the Bear Stearns collapse. He said right before it collapsed that it was doing great as well. And one of the things I find ironic is they actually have an inverse Jim Cramer ETF if you guys want to invest in that, because anything he says it seems to be the opposite. The bank lost 40% of their deposits in the first quarter, and they've lost 97% of their values in 2023. They dropped 43% on Friday alone. The Federal Reserve, FDIC took them in what's called a receivership, but basically they took control over the bank to be able to secure the deposits. And now there are reports that the banks of Chase and PNC are not going to buy their assets, most likely with pennies on the dollar. Now, there wasn't a big concern in the market about what was happening with the bank. The markets in the U.S. were mostly positive. Canada went down just by 0.25%, but everybody just, like Jay-Z says, just brush it off. That didn't seem to affect at all, because now everybody kind of knows that their money is quote unquote safe, at least until they launch the new government coin. But, nobody really reacted in regards to that. But if you really put things into perspective, we've had the 3 largest bank collapses in the history of the United States, literally in the last month or two. So everything's fine. Don't worry. One of the things also that I found that I thought was really interesting, that, I'm the kind of person, and I'm here in the U.S. right now, and I see everybody complaining about things. My latte isn't warm enough and my internet isn't fast enough. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is, did you know how much money you need to make to be in the top 1% of the world? So the entire world, everybody that makes money, what amount of money you need to make to actually be in the top 1%. Just take a guess for a second. It's $32,000. And euros, that would be 2,400 euros a month, or about $2,666 a month. So I know there are people that don't earn that much. If literally somebody in high school that's going to work in a McDonald's or a Panera or things like that are pretty close, if not above that number now. So just to kind of put that into perspective, whenever you're going to complain about how things are, remember, you're not in a war in Ukraine. You're not dying because you don't have potable water, for example, which happens a lot in places like Asia and also Africa. Just be grateful, because you're literally, if you're in the U.S., anywhere in the West, for the most part, you are in the 1%, right? So put that in perspective. Overseas market news, the European markets were mostly lower. We had Italy and Istanbul being the biggest losers there. Latin America was mostly higher. The Brazilian Bovespa, which is one of the big markets there, went up by 0.06%. Africa and the Middle East, mostly higher as well. And then in the far, far east, we have most of the markets being mixed, but they didn't go up or go down by a lot. A lot of them were under 1%. That might be 1, 2, 3%-ish. Bitcoin and crypto news. The European Central Bank says that it's entering its final stage of the investigation of the digital euro project. Remember, this is what I always thought was kind of the end game of Bitcoin, one of these crazy conspiracy theories that I have. I don't have my butt here today, but one of the crazy conspiracy theories is, what if the CIA created Bitcoin to test the technology to be able to launch the government coins or the CBDCs? And that's why they actually haven't found the founder. Because everything in Bitcoin is public, right? Everybody who buys it, sells it, all that stuff. So why can't they find the founder? Interesting, right? So Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe is actually going to introduce a gold-backed digital currency as well to serve as legal tender in the country. If you didn't know, I've been to Zimbabwe. I actually have a $100 trillion bill. They've had one of the worst inflation situations in the history of our society, let's call it. And if you haven't seen the Ancient Apocalypse series on Netflix from Graham Hancock about other previous civilizations, definitely recommend it, just to throw him. He did a great job on that series. Russia now is the second largest miner in the U.S., or a miner in the world after the United States. I thought this was really interesting because if you remember, they were actually really close to banning it, mining everything. And now since they're being sanctioned by the U.S. and almost the rest of the world, they need a way to be able to make their payments. So they're probably developing their own ruble coin or, Russia digital currency as well. Overall for the week, Bitcoin is higher, went up over 7%. It closed at just under 29,362. I took that number on Saturday. So remember, super volatile, so it might not be exact when you guys watch this video on Sunday. Commodities, 1,900 food production companies in the United States have been destroyed. Probably just a coincidence. U.S. crude and Brent are both down. This is due to the fact the economic data wasn't the best this week. So obviously, if the economy isn't going to grow very fast or not grow as expected or what the government tells you, because you can always believe what the government says, obviously there's going to be a lot less demand for oil and other industrial commodities, let's call them. And that's why it went down this week. Gold and silver. Gold went 0.33% to the upside at $19.91. Silver went down 0.07% to $25.15. One of the things I thought was really interesting is that central banks now are buying the most gold, or at the highest rate, let's say, since the 1950s. 30% of world economies are being sanctioned by the G7. And remember this kind of situation that we're having in the world now where everybody's starting to, there's a big kind of de-dollarization, dump the dollar kind of stuff in the news. And it's a big deal because most people don't realize that 70% of the money, the dollars that are in circulation, are outside of the United States. So check this piece of news out. The China, and I have it listed here. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I lost my place here for a second. There it is. So the trade between the Russians and the Chinese are now at 70% with Russian rubles or Chinese yuan. Before, remember, the entire world, the reason why they used dollars was because of the petrodollar. And basically what happened is United States made an agreement with with Saudi Arabia. So China made an agreement with Saudi Arabia to have Saudi Arabia sell all of their oil in dollars. And then they basically protected Saudi Arabia with our massive military that was much better and modern and the biggest in the world before. Now there's a lot of other big militaries, strong militaries. But the problem now will be that before, everybody needed dollars to transact. So if China before was going to pay Russia, what they would do is go out and buy dollars, have dollars in their reserves to be able to pay Russia in dollars, right? Now everybody's doing it direct. So instead of Russia going out and buying dollars to pay China, they're simply getting yuan from China, which is the currency in China. So this is a big problem because if 70% of the dollars in circulation are overseas, what happens when all of these countries stop using the dollar and all of those dollars come back home? If you think about a product, for example, or anything in the market, when there's a lot of it, obviously the value of that item goes down. So what happens if a value of a currency goes down? That's called inflation. So we might actually have inflation picking up, and it may not be because of our debt situation or our budget. It might simply be, and this is probably just an aspect of it, not the only thing, but that everybody's kind of setting their dollars back because nobody wants dollars anymore. Now, one of the things also that's really interesting is that the BRICS nations, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now have a larger percentage of the world economy than all of the G7 countries combined. So very soon, the majority of the economy won't be even demanding dollars, and that's when we're probably going to have a big problem in the United States. But it's probably nothing. The political news, in China, for the first time, the currency transactions that China does, for the first time, the yuan now is being used more than the dollar. So it looks like a lot of the countries, including China, which is kind of spearheading this motion, let's say, to get rid of the dollar, is picking up steam. The political news, Pfizer and Moderna, the mRNA things in your arm that I don't want to say starts with a B, ends with vaccines, are no longer authorized in the U.S. I wonder why. I'm sure they're safe and effective. Biden announced Tuesday that he's going to run for re-election. He's already turned 80 years old in November, and there's a lot of questions that are lingering about his age and mental stamina, because obviously he speaks very coherently and very presidential on his speeches. House of Representatives narrowly passed a bill to raise the debt ceiling, which includes sweeping spending cuts over the next decade. Not expected to pass. Remember that the House of Representatives now is controlled by the Republicans or the right, and then the Senate and also the presidency is controlled by the left. So even though the money bills, or let's call them the money laws, right, they're started in the House, they need to be approved by the Senate. And even if it was going to pass the Senate, Biden said that he would veto it anyway. So we're probably still going to have a problem with that debt limit. Corporate news, Tyson Foods is going to lay off 10% of its corporate workers and 15% of its leadership teams. 10% of its workforce would be 12,000 men and women. So you can see that a lot of the corporations now are still having problems with the situation with the layoffs, which means that a lot of companies are preparing for this supposed recession that we're walking into. Bed Bath & Beyond filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on Sunday, since they're not able to sell fancy things for your bathroom anymore. Microsoft shares rallied over 7% after reporting Q3 earnings, which surpassed estimates. They're doing really well, strength in its AI and cloud business. The UK did block their deal to try to buy Activision Blizzard for $69 billion, which includes popular games like Candy Crush, World of Warcraft, among others. And they said that they made some concessions, but apparently they weren't enough for the UK government. Chipotle surged as well, over 12%. They had $2.4 billion in sales and almost $300 million in profits, which is a record for them. So their stock went up by quite a bit. And even Meta, which is the owner of Facebook, exploded to the upside. It made Zuckerberg $10 billion after they reported their numbers as well, which were much better than what the analyst expected. Revenue came in at over $28 billion when it was under 28 estimated. And General Mills, which is the massive food company which first appeared on the stock market in 1928 in the New York Stock Exchange, just hit a record high at $89.39 after their costs and their sales went up. And I thought it was really interesting to share that because you can see how old this company is. It's really cool. Not a lot of trade news in technology. SpaceX had another rocket launch. They did test, remember, the huge, I believe it was the Falcon Heavy, which is called, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But one of the things I thought was really cool about that is they talked about how there's not going to be any tankers anymore going in the ocean. Essentially, what will happen is these cargo ships will go up into the atmosphere and you can get anywhere in the world in under an hour, basically. Can you literally think of just going to Tokyo to have dinner and then being back by 12 o'clock to be able to go to bed on time? Elon Musk is brilliant. In international events, the UN stated that India's population is going to match and exceed China's by the end of April. This is part of one of the reasons why I don't think China is going to be this kind of new world power that everybody talks about, due to the fact that they're actually going to have a population crash because they're now not having enough kids. And an interesting fact this week, Berkshire Hathaway Class A shares hit $500,000 a share of stock, which that hasn't reached that price since April 25th, 2022. And more than 19,000 volcanoes were found undersea after a new satellite. And if you didn't know, most of the ocean floor isn't even mapped out yet. So if they just found 19,000, can you imagine what they're going to find when they actually do have everything mapped out, considering that we've had all these earthquakes and volcanoes recently? That's the news for this week, guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe. And remember, the preppers were right.